The Michigan Renaissance Festival is about to begin. Tell us which OC TV show you're watching and we'll send you a limited number of tickets while supplies last. Just send a self-addressed stamped envelope to 1775 North Lapeer Road and we'll get them back to you. See you there. Huzzah!
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rachel Baker, and we're here in Addison Township interviewing local author Iris Underwood and illustrator Joyce Harlukowicz. Now, we are here to dig in a little deeper into the book that we interviewed her a few weeks ago and our book launch for the book called The Mantle. So we're going to hear and dig in a little deeper and see what this is all about. So, how long did it take you to write the book? And what was your inspiration?
Okay, the inspiration came out of my ancestry. Of Scott-Irish German ancestry, and the fact that I just love story, a good story, and the tragedy of losing my firstborn daughter. It just life experiences just blended all together. And when I went back to school as an older person to OCC, my teacher in the syllabus had a piece of fiction for an assignment. So when I sat down at my 386 computer to write this piece of fiction, that's where Rahabim came to mind, and this small tribe of people.
Okay.
And I couldn't shut it down. I went about 5 pages past the limitation, the page limit, and so I cut out a lot of the characters, and I wrapped up the story, and I submitted it for my grade. And I think I got an A on it, but something started, I could not stop. So that's how it began.
So it was really that far back is when you started writing this?
1994.
Wow! How did you go through that? That's a really long process. How did you go through that long process of turning an idea into words on a page?
I read a lot. I joined an organization called Detroit Working Writers. And at that time, I was shifting my careers from homemaker, mother. My girls were all raised. They were in the last one was in high school. And I counseled some of my older women friends to see how did they make that shift.
Yeah.
Because I was talking to women my age who were in serious crisis because they were empty nesters and they did not know what to do with the rest of their life. I was a young mother. So at 40 years old, maybe 42 years old, I realized, I have more of my life left than what I have lived.
Wow.
So what am I going to do with it? So one of the women said, Iris, do what you love to do. So I thought, okay, what do I love to do? I loved to write bad poetry.
I'm very good at that.
and I loved to write story. And I had just started really getting into reading. The day my third daughter went off to kindergarten, I sat in my wingback chair in a comfortable way with my legs dangling over, and I read Catherine Marshall's book, Christie. And that is really what inspired me to write my story.
What is that book about?
It's fiction, but it's based on Catherine Marshall's mother, who was from the South. So I related to that story.
So is it more of a historical fiction?
Yes. It was so well written, and I related to it. So from early on, intuitively, I had this idea, this belief, that we're more similar than we are different.
Yes.
And so I thought, I'm going to take Margaret Allen's advice and really examine what I want to do with my life. And I decided I wanted to be a writer.
Wow.
So I went back to school because my first degree was MRS degree from Central Michigan, and married young, raised my children. So here I am barely 42 years old, went back to school. It took several years, but I earned my degree from OU before I was 50 years old.
That is remarkable. I cannot tell you how inspiring that is. You know, to have gone through your life, hit a point, and go back and make a new start.
Well, it was difficult because when I went back to school, that's when my daughter was in and out of rehab, drug rehab, and that was very difficult. But I made it through before she died, and because I think it would have been really difficult, especially hearing what I heard in the halls. School was so different than what it was. College was so different than what it was when I went to school in the 70s. And it was very disturbing to hear what I heard. So I was glad to graduate, get out of there, and begin my writing career.
I can relate. Wow, that's remarkable, really, how you started. And you mentioned a tribe that was inspiring to you, and a little bit of your own ancestry. How did you combine those two, and what tribe was it that began your love for the book, that gave your idea?
Well, it was a fictitious tribe, the Mahari, which stayed with me throughout the whole process. They never, I get verklempt at times when I think about it. Because they never left me.
Wow.
Robin never left me. The king never left me. The queen. And when I returned to the book, which my middle daughter is really basically responsible for, because she said, Mom, that story you wrote about Robin, I think that would be good for highlights for young adults. So I pulled it out of the file and I started rewriting it. And then the sisters came back. Robin's sisters came back. And the priest came back, because so much of that was eliminated. And it wouldn't stop. It just wouldn't stop.
Did you notice your story taking new turns once you started writing? Like, did you watch your characters develop and kind of get away from you, or watch them become their own?
Oh, yes. It was a very long process. I had a lot to learn. When I was 4.5 years old, my parents moved from Kentucky to Detroit. And all that ancestry of knowing how to identify every tree. My grandfather harvested ginseng in the Appalachians, and as well as other roots and barks, and that was their medicine. And all that was snapped. So thankfully, I heard about Seven Ponds Nature Center, which is north of here. So I decided, let me go see what I can learn there. And I joined the Friends of Herbs, and that's where I met lavender. So that's why the vision for the lavender farm came several years after I dove into the story. So here I am in the perennial island, one beautiful day like today. And it was 7 years after Becky died. And I was starting to feel a little healthier at that point. I wasn't crying all the time. And I was writing for the Oxford Leader, who gave me my first break.
Wow.
They agreed to let me write encouraging words, and which was basically about the hardships and the happiness of raising 3 daughters.
And that was
my first break in the publishing industry.
And you continued to work that for how long?
3.5 years. And then the editor who hired me, he went someplace else, and then a female came in, and we bonded. Mara Lee was her name, and she introduced me to journalism. So I started writing profiles and features and meeting these wonderful people in the community who lived in the shadows. So I wrote about local heroes and gave them their 15 minutes of fame. And those people, every single interview provided some characterization for the characters in my novel, as well as my own family.
That's really, really sweet that you go and you went and you gave them the honor that they deserved, because it's true. I mean, I've learned this on the job myself. All the people that are here, really remarkable stories that you don't really hear just because it's so quiet and local.
Right.
All right. So, how did you conduct research for the book? I know you talked about Seven Ponds Nature Center and the class that you took at OCC and also OU. And did you do any research on the location or the setting of your book? I know you said it was fictional, but...
Right. I went to the Detroit Public Library and I found the most awesome book about the last Yana Indian. Ishi was his name. And I checked it out and I read it page by page. I copied the whole book and just absorbed that culture. That really helped because my culture had already pretty much been absorbed into the modern world. So I needed to truly immerse myself in an ancient culture.
All right. All this and more, we'll be right back.
Thank you for taking time to celebrate the publication of The Mantle, my first novel. The past 20 years, people have asked, "What's your book about?" If you approached a member of my Monday night critique group, you'd most likely hear various replies. Forgiveness, fidelity, redemption, love, resilience, and home. Yes, the story embodies these themes, yet they lay hidden when the Mantle and I were younger. I hadn't yet read enough stories like Moby Dick, The Doll Maker, and Silas Marner to perceive them. I hadn't experienced significant loss and gain to comprehend the Mahari way and their people. Heglin, the tribe's priest and protagonist who opens the Mantle crawling out of Elgaba, a meteor crater. And Stebban, the primary antagonist who believes the Mahari are fools. It took outside research and walking a good long while with King Joseph to see his guilt as a young prince when he overhears a dispute between his grandfather and childhood priest. After many rewrites, I at last heard the unknown word prophecy fall upon Prince Joseph's ears as he passed his priest's open window. I followed King Joseph and his horse Basha through the Mahari gate and prairie into the forest to the word tree before I realized he never speaks the word time. The Mahari and all known survivors of Humani have no knowledge of the clock. King Joseph, 7th generation since Humani, the invasion of disease and death from the other side of the mountain, listens to the stars and hears the Maker's message in an unknown tongue. He trusts the Maker for the interpretation to guide and multiply his people. Do I romanticize the writer's task? I believe not. Madeline L'Engle, author of Walking on Water, Reflections on Faith in Art, declares, we are to be in this world as healers, as listeners, and as servants. In art, we are once again able to do all the things we had forgotten. We are able to walk on water. We speak to the angels who call us. We move unfettered among the stars. We write, we make music, we draw pictures, because we are listening for meaning, feeling for healing. And during the writing of the story or the painting, we are returned to that open creativity which was ours when we were children. We cannot be mature artists if we have lost the ability to believe, which we had as children. An artist at work is in a condition of complete and total faith. It was by faith and frugality I traveled to Ireland, traversed a sea cave in search of verisimilitude to test the believability of the Mahari's legend of the weeping wind. There, I heard Prince Robin's voice. It was by faith I sat in my writing chair and did just that, in Ireland and home in my study. An Irish, Scot, German Appalachian, word by word, I trusted my inheritance to foster the way of the storyteller within me, the patient process that proclaims life is a miracle. Throughout our literature, Wendell Berry says in his essay titled The Work of Local Culture, the normal thing was for the generations to succeed one another in place. The memorable stories occurred when this succession failed or was somehow threatened. The norm is given in Psalm 128, in which this succession is seen as one of the rewards of righteousness. Thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. This longing seems to have been universal, Berry says. It presides also over the Odyssey, in which Odysseus's desire to return home is certainly regarded normal. The Bible makes much of what it sees as normal succession. In such stories as those of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or David and Solomon, in which the son completes the work or the destiny of the father. The parable of the prodigal son is prepared for by such Old Testament stories as that of Jacob, who errs, wanders, returns, is forgiven, and takes his place in the family lineage.
And we're back with local author Iris Underwood and illustrator Joyce Harlukowicz. Now, okay, so I wanted to ask you, what are some overarching themes that you put into your book? I know that you were mentioning it before at the book launch a couple weeks ago, how you put themes of forgiveness, love, resilience, redemption. These are really powerful themes. How did you weave those in, and why?
Well, I wove them in over time, just living life, recovering from loss. I think Ishi represented to me a very significant example of forgiveness. He was the last Indian of his tribe that was sought after, literally hunted, and taken captive. And his mother was still living at the time, an ancient woman, and he forgave. He forgave the extinction of his tribe. He forgave being taken out of his culture, out of his land. And the gentleman who mentored him was loving and kind and gave him opportunities. So he forgave. And then I just remember my own life. Being a Christian, that is a primary principle. If we don't forgive, we're harming ourselves. We cannot learn, we cannot be free if we don't forgive. So, and then when my daughter died, it was paramount that I forgive the drug dealers. It was paramount that I forgive myself and all of us who loved her but could not manage to save her life. And then the resilience theme, here again, Ishi, my own mother, my father who was a World War II vet and came back just so traumatized. It was never acknowledged that he suffered such trauma.
Right.
My grandmother from Kentucky, a wonderful example of forgiveness and resilience. I learned that at her dimpled elbows, canning tomatoes and such things. And then throughout my life, just seeing examples of people who forgave the bondage that they had been in.
Wow.
One kind or another. And they lived their life in that freedom of forgiveness.
That is amazing that you were able to implement all of that into the book.
And it was subconscious. I did not.
You didn't intend that?
No, because I needed healing. I needed to forgive myself. And I needed to forgive my mother and my husband. I needed to forgive my daughters. I needed to forgive my sisters. We all had a role in not knowing exactly what to do with an addicted family member. And we deal with that. It's rampant in our culture.
Yes.
And whether we know it or not, we walk around, we wake up every morning with that guilt, not knowing that that is what we are bothered with, what troubles us. So writing The Mantle was a process for my own healing. And I thank God for it.
Right.
It took a while. The farm was a 10-year interruption. And then when it was finished, the big question of who is going to illustrate this for me?
Right.
Who's going to be aware spiritually, emotionally? Who's going to know my life well enough to do that? Who's going to get into the story well enough? So I called Joyce.
I think this is a good time then to take a shift and ask you about the illustrations and some of the inspirations behind them. You said that you did pastels.
Yes.
Is that a favorite medium of yours?
Yes. That's
right.
my favorite way to process art.
And how long have you been in art or painting or drawing?
About 25 years.
Wow.
Started with lessons in Romeo. I happened to, in the early 1990s, stroll into a newly opened art studio and gallery in downtown Romeo, and learned at that time that not only did the gallery owner paint many of the paintings that were in the gallery, but he also taught lessons. And for Christmas, a friend knew of my interest in art, and it was a good time in my life to step into that interest, and gave me a gift certificate for art classes. That's how I got my start.
Did you find you had a natural talent for it, or was it more of a tedious process to learn all of the techniques that you had to?
I've been an artist all my life.
Really?
I've known that all my life.
Wow.
But in preparation for finishing school, finding a career, I am a retired teacher. All of that was subsumed until that point in time, that particular point in time, where I could then pick up that interest and develop it.
It's remarkable to me that both of you were able to have such productive careers before you were even artists, and that you were able to come back and make so much out of your talents. I mean, that is a prime example of not throwing away any potential that you may have in living the fullest life. I mean, that's always been, I think, when I talk to my friends and young people, like as well, like I know myself personally, that is a fear that we share, is will we live productive lives, and will we fulfill our own potential and still be able to enjoy what life has to offer? And I think you two are perfect examples of ways that you were able to do that. Really remarkable story, both of you. Do you have a favorite artist that you were inspired by?
Well, many different artists. I do enjoy the Impressionists a great deal.
Okay.
Monet, Degas, they're stylistically and how they use pastels, not just pastels, but they painted in other media as well. But it's very common for artists to look back to the Impressionists and that period in art history as a period of inspiration.
So how did the reading and the book help make your art? How did you use her book, in other words, to make your illustrations?
Well, I am a retired English teacher, so writing and reading fit very well into this entire scheme. I knew when Iris approached me that the very first thing I'd have to do was read the book. And I don't remember if she was surprised, but she understood that the inspiration for the artwork would have to be fueled somehow. When I calculated that it would be 20 hours of reading, that may have surprised her a bit, but it was 20 hours of reading to complete this marvelous and just it's a spectacular story.
And the fact that it is so profound, it has so many
Yes.
deep themes woven into it. How did you put that into your art? Or capture the desperation or fear, perhaps, and perseverance into your own illustrations?
My personal way of looking at literature and the way that I choose the literature that I read is primarily looking for beauty. So it was the element of beauty that I saw in the story. For instance, one of the illustrations is a horse by a river. And the Mahari people love horses and use horses in that culture very much. Another element is the characterization. I truly fell in love with the characters in this book because, I must confess, I'm not a fiction reader. I enjoy nonfiction primarily. I do like historical fiction, so I treated Iris's work as a bit of historical fiction, but what really captured my interest was the characters. So therefore, not just King Joseph, who is on the cover of the book, but particularly Queen Hashti.
And what was it about her?
How she managed her family, how she left her prior life in a different tribe to subsume her own interests in the interests of King Joseph, whom she married, and then the family that she raised, the daughters, and finally the heir to the throne who comes along, who is Prince Rabam. And her hands, how she worked to provide for her family, particularly the food that was provided for them in their circumstances. So the painting, which is used as an illustration in the book, features her hands serving bread, which bread we know is a rather universal element for life.
Yes.
And
symbolic.
A very important element in the story is the allusion to scriptures. The winged book represents that element. So those were such very important elements coming from the book. The richness of the story, there is so much more. If I were to go back now, there would probably be about 12 other paintings I could do.
And how many did you do?
We did a total of 8.
All right, would you mind bringing them out? These two ladies so graciously brought out the cover of the book, and look at all this art. I mean, it is exquisite, marvelously done, but you're gonna have to wait until next week until you hear this. So for part 2, stay tuned. Back to you.